The third day of testimony in the trial of the Isleworth millionaire accused of murdering his wife. Today, an expert on forensic toxicology took the stand and discussed alcohol and antidepressants found in Diane Ward's system after her death. Both sides discussed the potential side effects of some of those medications, including aggression and hallucinations.
You don't know what effect the citalopram that you've acknowledged was in her system, you don't know what effect that had on Mrs. Ward on September 21st, 2009.
I don't know the effect, but I don't have any evidence per se that would suggest that she was having issues with the drug.
A DNA expert testified about how evidence was taken from the scene and said their findings regarding whether Mrs. Ward's DNA was found on the gun were inconclusive. This is Bob Ward's second trial. He was previously convicted. A legal technicality overturned that, however.